Okay, we are live.
Should I start or?
Please go ahead.
Oh, all right. Well, welcome everybody to our event, What Happened, the Trump Presidency in Review, in partnership with American Compass and the American Conservative. We've got a really good discussion for you all. I hope some of you who are tuning in now have had a chance to read the 6 pieces that have gone up both at American Compass and TAC earlier today. Really good stuff, and we're going to be going into a little bit more detail today during this event. So without further ado, I guess it's time to bring in the other panelists, and I'll introduce them all individually. So first we've got Oren, the Executive Director of American Compass, Rachel Bovard, Senior Director of Policy at the Conservative Partnership Institute, and Ross Douthat, a columnist at the New York Times. So welcome all of you.
Oh, thanks.
Thanks.
I think what we'll start with is there are, I guess, 3 areas that we really want to talk about today. There's the question of personnel and staffing the Trump administration and how that went and what went wrong and what should be done better next time. The second one is the economic performance of the Trump economy. And then the third is the role of the conservative movement and how they sometimes helped and sometimes hindered the movement forward of kind of a Trumpy agenda. So I guess if we're going to start with personnel, I suppose the best place to start is with you, Rachel, whose piece in this series was about the staffing of the Trump administration. It goes into a lot of detail about that. So maybe if you could just give us a rundown quickly in not as long as your piece, but the big points for everybody to hear.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me and putting this together. So the biggest takeaway from my piece is that, the Trump administration really suffered from a lack of cohesion across the ideological spectrum. I think, people really focus on a couple of things when it comes to personnel, chief among them expertise, heft, gravitas, all these things, but they forget about the fact that you have to have ideological alignment among your staff. And it can't just be, at the cabinet level. It can't just be the chief of staff. It has to be, top to bottom. People have to be willing to do battle for the president's agenda. And now I don't want to confuse this with sycophancy, right? Or yes men. That's not at all what we're talking about. We're talking about people who have a deep and fundamental connection to the president's governing agenda. And I think we saw in spades that Trump didn't have that. And that was right from the get-go, right? He appointed Chris Christie to his transition team, a man who had no tangible connection at all to sort of the Trump agenda or what Trump was trying to do. And so you saw his personnel selections reflect that, with the help of the team that he brought in from New Jersey, again, completely disconnected from the campaign, resulted in sort of that entire network of selections being tossed in the Trump Tower dumpster. Trump eventually got it right, but it took a really long time. He gave tremendous deference, I think, to his cabinet secretaries, many of whom, who sort of tangentially understood what Trump was trying to do, but in practice couldn't execute, in part because, they weren't necessarily ideologically committed. But people like Rex Tillerson, in theory, created what he did in the business sector, but couldn't translate that to sort of the levers of power and managing a bureaucracy that at many times was at odds, and very skillfully at odds with what the president was trying to do. So eventually Trump, I think, did sort of try to right the ship, bringing in John McEntee to head PPO, someone who really did seem to understand, that he needed to pick people who were aligned with Trump, but also people who were skilled enough and bullish enough to push the levers of power in Trump's direction. But unfortunately, that was so late in the game, it didn't have that much of an impact. And then finally, Trumpism or whatever Trumpism we will define it as today didn't necessarily have a broad base of support in Washington. And so, at the end of my piece, I touch on the fact that traditional areas where staff have gone from Capitol Hill to, Republican institutions in DC to the White House, that pipeline wasn't necessarily there. He didn't really have a group of people or an intellectual base in DC that was ready, willing, and capable of going in and bending the levers of power toward what Trump wanted to do. So, all of those areas, I think, really hurt the Trump administration. And going forward, I think the focus has to be on that intellectual and ideological commitment in an administration, which is something the Trump administration definitely lacked.
Now, one thing that kind of comes to mind about this is very early on, right after the inauguration, Steve Bannon said something to the effect of the Trump you fought for, the Trump administration you helped to get elected is basically gone. And in retrospect, that seems like a somewhat astute observation. And it took them, I guess, 3.5 years or so to get to kind of start to work out some of this stuff. Why did it take so long?
I think it was a willingness of Trump or his administration, I think, to defer a lot of power to sort of Washington insiders. I think whether it was Trump or the people around him were very compelled by this idea of someone like Reince Priebus, right, who was very networked by Washington standards and had a lot of credibility by Washington standards. But there was no oversight given to him. There was no direction given to him. There's very little transparency that anyone in Trump's inner circle had toward how they were staffing the White House. And that, once those people were in place, they were very difficult to get rid of. And so I think there were some very key moves made very early on that really shaped the Trump administration for the next 3 years. And it wasn't until those changes were made, at those key areas, the chief of staff, PPO, even agency heads, that we started to see the ship of state turn a little bit in Trump's direction. But again, he was also, I think it was a lack of engagement by the Trump team to even get rid of some Obama holdovers that really affected them in the end as well.
Now, Oren, you were on our podcast last week, and I mentioned how, when we look at some of this personnel stuff and just kind of the inability to grab hold of the machinery of government, and I sort of joke that the big problem with Trump is that he's not Richard Nixon. So what are the consequences of that? And how can kind of Republicans be thinking about how to do it better next time?
Well, I think, Trump's not Richard Nixon or anyone else. The ways in which he was such a unique figure and many things really core to his style, I think, in a sense, made this harder. A lot of the things Rachel's underscoring, and as she pointed out at the end, if you were going to do better than that, you would have really had to have a president and inner circle who were laser focused on these exact questions. And obviously the administration was not. I do also think there's just sort of an inherent challenge if you're an iconoclast and you run against the establishment and you want to shake things up, then you sort of show up and there's no one there who's ready to staff your administration, almost by definition. And typically what we've seen in American politics is the iconoclasts lose. So whether you're thinking of Barry Goldwater or what the New Democrats started to do in the 80s, they actually had a lot of time in the wilderness to build up some of that infrastructure so that by the time you have a Bill Clinton show up in 1992, there is a progressive policy institute. There is essentially 10 years of work done. There are binders on the shelves to start to take over. And so in that sense, Trump was almost a victim of his own success, where he actually won with no political infrastructure or institutional infrastructure around him. And that's then going to be a problem when you get into the White House, even if you're an extremely efficient and focused executive, which I think it's safe to say he wasn't. So I think both of those dimensions have to be better in the future. We need elected officials who are going to focus on that and invest the attention and a certain sort of consistency in doing better in that respect. But we also need to have the institutional infrastructure to draw from, because your best personnel moves are never going to be better than the pool that's out there.
Now, Ross, you've been very, very critical of the Trump administration, and I on some of these same grounds, I think, as us, but I guess you make the reasonable point that the buck does stop with the president when it comes to these things. But is there, do you kind of give him a little bit of leeway for not being able to work this stuff out because he is such an iconoclast? Or what do you think about all of this stuff?
Well, I mean, I think you need to distinguish between the kind of victim of your own success problem that Oren is describing that would have attended any figure, from a Goldwater down to a Ross Perot who won in the way that Trump did, and Trump's own distinctive indifference to anything resembling a sort of granular understanding of policy, which, again, most politicians are not enmeshed in all of the details of policy, but the difference between the level of engagement that a George W. Bush gave to the sort of workings of policy in his White House and the level of engagement that Trump gave was substantial. I think it's fair to say. And obviously the same goes for sort of Democratic peers, whether a Clinton or an Obama. And in that sense, you sort of have a double problem, right? You have the problem of the iconoclast who gets there without, having the personnel, who gets out ahead of the personnel he would need. And then you have the fact that for Trump to succeed in that environment, he would have needed to be sort of, at least as engaged as a typical president would be, and probably much more so. And instead, he was much less engaged. And then you also have the further problem where, Trump had a temperamental affinity for figures within the Republican coalition who fundamentally disagreed with the agenda that he ran on in 2020, in 2016, right? So, Trump ran as some kind of, anti-Austerian, anti-Ryan Republican kind of figure who was willing to spend a lot more money than the Romney-Ryan ticket was promising to spend in 2012. But the people he liked in Congress were not the sort of Susan Collins, Joe Manchin zone of moderate Democrats and Republicans who could have, worked with him on a big infrastructure bill. They were the hard ass Tea Party guys, right? Like that was who Trump liked. He liked Mark Meadows. He liked Mulvaney. He liked these kind of guys. Similarly in foreign policy, right? Like Trump ran obviously as a kind of not an isolationist, but some kind of realist. And, you can make a sort of strained argument that John Bolton is not a neocon. He's actually a realist or something. But, fundamentally, Trump liked guys like Bolton, who seemed like hard ass hawks, and put them in key positions and then lived to regret it. Right. Substantially so in the case of Bolton. So I think that was part of the problem, too. Right. That like even independent of sort of the policy minutia at the level of temperament, Trump liked people who were not and put in positions of power people who were not on board necessarily with some of his, fundamental heterodoxy. So I think I agree with basically everything that Oren and Rachel said, but I think that too was part of the problem. And the exceptional figure is Bannon himself. And I'm sort of, Bannon was the person best positioned, obviously, to be a kind of Karl Rove, what Karl Rove did with Bush, Bannon aspired to do with Trump. And, there are a lot of theories about why that didn't work. I think as an outside observer, it seemed to me that Bannon simply wanted too much power, in a sense, too quickly, that the core of the Bannon agenda was figuring out, how you realign the electorate on economic policy, which, as he kept saying during the transition, would have started with an infrastructure bill or some sort of populist economic agenda. But he gets in the White House and he really wants power over the National Security Council or something. And it just seemed like he was trying to run the whole administration and ended up running none of it very, very quickly. And maybe there's an alternative timeline where Bannon was slightly less ambitious, but actually got more done. But, either way, once he was gone, then it was just Republican functionaries and the family, neither of whom had any particular commitment to populism or, whatever we want to call Trumpian foreign policy.
Now, your piece, Rachel, talks about some of this. There's a nice phrase in there, big names over steady hands. And I think that really gets to the heart of the problem with people like Bolton or the various other people on Fox News that Trump saw and wanted. And we saw, I think, a lot of the kind of MAGA universe would defend decisions like this on the grounds that Trump was doing some sort of team of rivals thing or a good cop, bad cop thing. Why is it a mistake to think that way? And a kind of secondary question, we've got a couple people chiming in on the Q&A asking, what is the PPO? And I might add to that, why is it important?
Maybe I should start with that because it is sort of a fundamental part of this. So the White House Office of Presidential Personnel, PPO office, they are the ones who select, vet, and place the majority of sort of, they select the political appointments then confirmed by the Senate, or they place people who are unconfirmed, in various appointments throughout the administration. So they are very critical to how your administration will be staffed, selecting the right people, and getting, can you guys still?
Yeah, we can hear you.
We can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, I just fell off the screen. Okay. Anyway, so PPO is a critical component of what Trump was trying to do, and it was staffed originally by Johnny DiStefano, who was a John Boehner hand, close ties to Karl Rove, downtown fundraising elements. Again, no tangible personnel experience, no tangible commitment to the Trump agenda, and so his tenure largely served to sort of shepherd in people who really wanted a White House job, and wanted to put it on the resume, but weren't actually committed to the Trump agenda. So that's kind of the first question. The second question, sort of dealing with the big names issue. I think Trump was very attracted to this idea of big names staffing up with, really qualified people, or in his view of, heft and gravitas, I think played very heavily into his calculation. And sometimes it works, but I think the critical problem that he had was when you bring in, big names and principals in their own right, they don't become staff. They remain as principals, and they aren't willing to subordinate their own agenda to what the president is trying to do. And I think the classic example of this was Gary Cohn, Trump's original economic advisor, who was, came from Goldman Sachs, was very successful, but also a registered Democrat. But, I think Trump was very attracted to the profile that he brought to the White House, but it ended in the fact that Gary Cohn was there to push his own agenda, not Trump's agenda. And, the infamous anecdote of him removing a letter from Trump's desk without Trump's knowledge that would have ended the US free trade agreement with Korea, because again, that was his agenda, that wasn't Trump's agenda. So you can bring in big names, but I think largely it fails when they are unwilling to actually participate in what the president's trying to do. They still remain as principals.
So to maybe sum up a little bit, it's not just a problem of trusting people and then being proved wrong. He more or less put the big staffing decisions of the administration in the hands of his political enemies. Do you think that's putting it too strongly?
To some extent, with people who are registered Democrats, yes, but I think Trump also gave a tremendous amount of deference to Washington establishment creatures, right? Like Johnny DiStefano, like Mitch McConnell, who very early on told Trump, hey, I don't want to hear any more of this drain the swamp talk. I mean, people who, were Republican functionaries, but were not committed to the Trump agenda, had no idea what the Trump administration wanted to do and didn't care, were only really sort of focused on putting their people in positions where they could get things done. So you had people working at cross purposes with the Trump administration, and Trump was too willing, I think, to give them deference when in fact he shouldn't have been.
Well, what would Italics Ross make of this problem? I'm a little bit curious. Ross, did you want to jump in on this?
Who is Italics Ross, Jordan? I just, for viewers who aren't consistent readers of my column, Italics Ross is, I guess, the rather more reactionary and also pro-Trump voice in my head that I occasionally allow out to make bad arguments, which I then obviously just swat down. I think Italics Ross in this area, I think, would actually have pretty similar views to non-Italics Ross, in the sense that, he would say, look, you have to treat, he would say a lot of the things that sort of the establishment press reacted to with horror about Trump, in terms of sort of, approaches to personnel, the idea that you would, just sort of, fire people here, remove civil service protections there, do all of this kind of stuff. That stuff is in fact what a transformational Republican president might need to do. You just can't do it if you, one, don't have people ready to fill those roles who are actually competent and capable, and two, are like Trump himself, not prepared to sort of think strategically about what you're doing, right? So in that sense, you could say, the sort of Trumpism looks like a dry run for, some future radical transformation of American government by a populist political figure. But it's, the lessons you can draw are lessons about sort of appropriate impulses, not effective actions, right?
Mhm.
But so some of the stuff that gets cast as sort of terrifying fascism on the march, right? Like the federal architecture stuff, right? Italics
That's
Ross
something
and non-italics Ross are both completely on board with making American architecture great again, right? Like that kind of thing was good, and is the kind of thing that should have been happening sort of as, I guess the problem was often that like sort of less central decisions ended up being made in the way that you would want more central decisions to be made, almost, right? So you would have a few people who figured out, well, this is what a disruptive, effective administration would do, and they would go ahead and do things like that. But that never applied at the macro level to the people running economic policy, foreign policy, and so on. Although I will say that Steve Mnuchin, in the end, I think if you're, in terms of sort of looking for figures who had no ideological profile whatsoever and ended up being relatively effective stewards of what Trump sort of promised in 2016. I think, Mnuchin's negotiations around, with sort of between the Republican Party and Nancy Pelosi almost got Trump reelected, I think.
Right.
And that's sort of worth, if Mnuchin had his way, there would have been a second relief bill much earlier than the one we're still talking about now, and might not have made the difference, but it would have helped Trump more than the sort of Steve Moore, Art Laffer, unemployment insurance is bad and we need less of it to stimulate the economy approach.
I definitely want to get into that second stimulus in the economic performance bit, because that's a hugely important thing where a lot of these kind of tensions were drawn out. But before we get there, I wanted to ask Oren, we can talk about the missed opportunities or how nice it would have been if we had sort of a populist heritage foundation or something that could kind of give have the binders on the shelves. But we also had this kind of hostile takeover of the Republican Party, and I guess I wonder if it could have been any different. That's a counterfactual, but what do you make of that question?
Well, with Trump, I call it an almost sort of Shakespearean question more than a political one of, could you have had the effective and importantly disruptive parts of Trump without the ineffective, if not downright counterproductive parts?
Right.
And you can in a lab design the kind of ideal figure who you'd say could do that, but in practice it may, and certainly empirically it appears to have been the case, that you had to have someone who cared so little about what the experts thought to be willing to point out places where a lot of the experts happen to be wrong. Mm-hmm. And so it may be in the nature of our politics that you have to have. I think Julius Krein in his essay makes a great distinction between a transitional presidency and a transformational one, and that transitional type of step is going to be separate from the transformational one. Mm-hmm. Again, with the weird phenomenon that Trump in fact won. There's the expression of the dog caught the car. I've extended that to the moose jumped in front and the car slammed into it and the dog slammed into the back of the car as maybe the better description of what we experienced. But however, whichever metaphor you prefer, the point at the end of the day would be, we got a little bit of a pileup, and I think what has been heartening to see and what's important to think about looking forward is, regardless of who's in the White House, the work has to be done in all of the other institutions of our politics so that we can actually make forward progress, and so that the next time around there are ways to address a lot of these problems we're talking about.
Well, let's move on to the next section on the economic performance of the Trump economy. And I think, having talked to a lot of kind of more typical kind of Freedom Caucus type conservatives, they were very, very happy with the Trump economy, which admittedly was very good. But in your piece, Oren, you talk about how it wasn't the tax cuts really that did that. And I think that's probably an argument that's worth unpacking for the people that are watching and explaining why they're pursuing a pretty typical Republican economic agenda was not necessarily the thing that created the results that they liked.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the starting point, as you started with, is to say that the Trump economy really was very strong, sort of leading into the point when COVID hit. There were some measures on which you could say it didn't look as good or it looked better. But at the end of the day, the unemployment rate was the lowest it had been since the late 1960s, and wages were rising, particularly at the bottom. For decades, we'd seen this pattern where the fastest wage increases were with higher educated and higher income workers, whereas now we were actually seeing the greatest wage increases at the bottom of the labor market. And so those, I think, are sort of unconditional points of celebration that, frankly, you'll see folks across the political spectrum acknowledging at this point. The question is why? Why was that happening? And as you said, there's one theory that says, well, you see, because the one big thing we did was a tax cut, and it worked just the way we said it would. And I think the important thing to underscore is that there's just no empirical support for that argument. The theory behind corporate tax cuts, high income tax cuts as a way to drive the economy is that that's supposed to spur a lot more investment, that you're making it relatively more attractive to invest. So you're going to see a lot of that happen. And as a result, you're going to get the kinds of productivity gains and wage growth and everything else we want. And so it's actually quite easy to go and look and say, okay, well, did it spur investment? And the answer is no, it did not. It did not. It showed no signs whatsoever of spurring investment. In fact, investment was slowing and even concerningly starting to decline in 2019. And again, this is not actually an especially controversial point. AEI did a very good symposium that Aparna Mathur, who then went to Trump's Council of Economic Advisors, edited. And I think they had 20 plus economists and other experts from across the political spectrum. And maybe with one exception, they all said there's just either it obviously did not work or there's just no evidence that it has worked yet. So you could make a claim that these things take longer to kick in and tax cuts are the right policy and they just didn't have time to really get going. That's a fine claim for us to debate someday, but you can't claim that a tax cut that didn't get going yet is the cause of the economic gains that we did see. And so that just can't be the explanation for what we saw happening. I think it's equally important to recognize that it would be hard to make a case that sort of the what we would call more kind of MAGA policies are the effect. So, it's not that the trade war with China was the reason that we saw this success. And again, I think there's a somewhat parallel timeline point to be made, which is just that, it is hard to make out the kinds of gains you would want to see from a different approach to trade policy within the first year or two. Right. And in fact, you don't. You do see a shift in the relationship with China and decline in imports from China, also decline in exports to China. But that mostly shifted then to importing more from other countries instead. We didn't see the boom in investment. We didn't see the big increases in our own domestic capacity. And so what you're left with actually is that what happened was we ran incredibly aggressive expansionary fiscal and monetary policy at the top of a business cycle, by which I mean we had low interest rates and cut interest rates almost as if we were in the middle of a recession, even though unemployment was at 4% and then below. We ran $1 trillion deficits, even though unemployment was at 4% or below. If you compare those policies to what we'd done in the past, they looked like the policies of a deep recession. Whereas if you look at what we'd been doing, during the Clinton boom, prior to the Great Recession in the mid-2000s, we weren't spending anything like that in terms of fiscal stimulus. Interest rates were many points higher. And so it's good news in a sense. There's some really interesting stuff to learn there that what economists had thought about, the economy's getting too hot, we got to slam on the brakes here, wasn't really true. In fact, the hot economy was great, and it was great for exactly who we wanted it to be great for, which was particularly lower income workers. The only problem is that's just not a sustainable policy in and of itself. You can't just do that forever. At some point, you actually need the investment, the productivity gains that drive our prosperity. And so I think it remains an open question. Okay, how do we make that work?
In other words, we were running a very, very hot economy without any kind of strategy to take advantage of that or direct that in a particular direction or anything. Ross, did you want to jump in on that? You look like you did it a minute ago.
Oh, I'm sure I had many intelligent thoughts a minute ago, but now they're all gone. Yeah, I mean, I basically agree with Oren. I might be a little bit more sympathetic to it's not so much that I think we can run the economy hot forever as that I think, there's some reason to hope that by running the economy hot, you do, I mean, I think, Oren, you concede some of this in your essay, you do sort of, create some necessary preconditions for the kind of, future investments and so on that you want the economy to have. You create the preconditions for, people to get married and have more kids. There's sort of a preconditioning generally of having an economy run hotter than our economy has run for a long time that is good and shouldn't be sort of minimized. I think if you were, the case for the sort of Trumpy side of this being important is, I mean, one, that he was more likely than other Republicans to want an economy running hot. He had no commitment to sort of, monetary hawkishness, to put it mildly. He was the only kind of Republican who would like publicly jawbone the Fed chair and complain about rate hikes. And, I don't think this was the key factor, but I think probably the fact that immigration rates did go down played some role, probably a little bit more of a role than a lot of economists would think in the increase in wages at the bottom of the wage distribution. And that was sort of purely Trump. And then the final thing I'd say is that I agree with Oren about the effects of the tax bill. I think the tax bill is best defended, slightly ironically, as a kind of, for all the sort of ancillary elements, right? So if you built around the corporate tax cut were a lot of, I think, very worthwhile efforts at right-wing social engineering, the kind of thing that, to say something that the Wall Street Journal editorial page would, abhor, right? But the fact that, built around the corporate tax cut are, a really worthwhile cut to the, deduction, state and local tax deductions, right? That mostly benefit blue state rentiers. The fact that you had, the modest increase in the child tax credit, the fact that you're trying to tax university endowments, all of those kind of things, I think, were, again, things that were sort of small examples of what a more effective Trump administration would have done at a larger scale, but also were not fundamentally about economic stimulus. They were literally efforts at social engineering.
Yeah, Julius Krein makes a good point about that in his essay as well, which is that, in a sense, the both most effective and probably most lasting parts of TICJA, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, were those tax increases that Ross just mentioned. The capping deductions, the tax on endowments, child tax credit, which is a cut, but exactly the kind that the supply siders don't like. And so what was most effective and likely to be most lasting really was actually something that represented potentially a pretty significant shift in the orthodoxy.
And Rachel, did you want to jump in on this one too?
Well, I think what, is most interesting to me about Trump from the broad sort of economic perspective, when you get to questions about traditional Republican approaches to economics, is that, and I think Dan McCarthy points this out in the opening of the essay series, is that Trump wasn't actually that different from a lot of Main Street Republicans in his emphasis. He still wanted tax cuts. He still, talked about the stock market a lot, responded to the performance of tech stocks. Those are very traditional Republican things. But I think what was different about Trump and what I think can be a sustainable course for a Republican future is the emphasis of those things. Because for so many Republicans, the emphasis is exclusive. It's, tech stocks, the stock market performance and tax cuts, full stop. But I think Trump took a much more rounded approach at, not only the economy, which he broadened to include our immigration rates, kind of the right-wing social engineering that Ross mentioned, can the economy work for the culture, but also took on culture wars as, all sort of a holistic spectrum approach to what, a Republican economic policy will look like. And I think that was a broad part of his appeal from an economic perspective that I think can actually sustain in the Republican Party should they choose to.
And I think maybe it's worth dwelling on for a little bit about the second COVID stimulus and the negotiations about that. I know there was a lot of interest in us talking about this a little bit more, and it gets to both questions about the economic policies of the administration and also the conservative movement. And I think one thing that was pretty interesting is from the beginning there was resistance in the administration from people close to it, from people like Art Laffer, Steve Moore, and Larry Kudlow, to doing a second one. And then those people were basically in the inner circle. And then also from the outside, you had basically Trump's most loyal parts of the conservative movement coming out against more of it. And it was sort of like this moment that seemed both politically suicidal and maybe a mistake policy-wise. And so it strikes me that there's kind of this is a great example of conservative orthodoxies kind of shooting them in the foot. I think it's worth kind of unpacking what happened there and what lessons the conservative movement ought to take about it, from it. Ross, how about we start with you about that one, because you feel strongly about this.
Yeah, I mean, look, you don't want to overplay the politics of it too much, right? I mean, I don't think anyone can say definitively, oh, if only you had passed this, this extra relief package, Trump would have come closer or actually won. But I think that it was both a political and a policy no-brainer, basically, that it was very clear that the initial effort that the Trump White House supported to prop up the economy during periods of both, directly ordered shutdowns, but also just sort of a retreat from commerce by people who were scared of the coronavirus, that was incredibly effective, right? Like the US economy weathered this incredible shock without a stock market crash, with people's incomes actually going up, all of these things that, made it possible for Trump to even be mildly competitive in the election. If the economy had just looked the way it looked, 3 weeks into the crisis, Trump really would have lost in the kind of landslide that the polls seem to foretell. And on the policy front, like a bill independent of the debate about whether sort of stimulus works, the sort of Keynesian arguments, the pandemic did not create the kind of conditions that a normal economic crash or recession create. It's not a situation where like people are over-investing in restaurants or over-investing in real estate and then they get their comeuppance. It's, the pandemic is literally a once in a century event that makes people not want to go out to eat because they're scared they're going to die. And that's why it's reasonable to call it relief, not stimulus. You are literally trying to temporarily tide the economy over. There's, you don't even have to get into debates about, the multiplier and a stimulus in the teeth of a recession and all of that. So that, I think that combination of politics and policy it made it pretty obvious that the Trump White House should have, not just notionally supported this, but sort of pushed on the open door with Democrats. And I think fundamentally, there was plenty of resistance to it from these different factions in the party, but a fully engaged president, and this goes back to the, I think boring but correct point that I've been making about Trump, a more engaged president could have just bulldozed that opposition. If Trump had come out in late summer and said, look, this is a litmus test of your loyalty to me, whether you're going to pass, another Trump bucks, right, leading up to the election, it would have passed. So.
There were definitely opportunities where he could have kind of reached over the conservative coalition and basically forced them to fall in line, and he didn't really seem like he had the either savvy or interest in doing that. But Rachel, do you think it's time to show some of these supply siders the door, or what?
Well, I think, key to the second stimulus negotiations was something that Ross mentioned, which I think that in March, you definitely had this consensus that this was about relief. You had a broad consensus that, Congress needed to act to help Americans. I think that consensus was lost. by the second time around. You definitely had people within the administration, Kudlow on the inside, Moore and Art Laffer, although I tend to think we blow up their significance a little bit more as like the boogeymen of the right or populist right, more than they actually are. But they were all saying like, look, no, we need to let the economy, traditional Republican arguments. But what I really think we fail to address, and I think Ross touched on this a little bit, is the fact that there was zero interest from congressional Republicans. And almost to a point where the Republican Senate, Mitch McConnell was like, we're not doing this. And there was no effort from the White House on the Leg Affairs team or the president himself to use Ross's word, bulldoze his way through it. I mean, we can talk about the outside conservative movement as a hang up, but I really think had Trump muscled this through Congress, given them a bill, told Mnuchin to lay on the tracks in front of Pelosi to get it done, I think you would have seen more action, but you just didn't see a cohesive strategy to either focus on A, what the president wanted, and B, what it was going to take to get it done. So I actually put the failure of it more on that legislative strategy than actually on sort of these economic, advisors or factors.
Well, I mean, and the other thing that's worth stressing is that in the period when this didn't happen, I think there was a widespread assumption that you weren't going to have, among a lot of Republicans, that you weren't going to have the kind of fall wave of the coronavirus that we've actually had. I'm critical. I'm critical of that take. I should say, though, that part of me in late August and early September certainly hoped that the herd immunity threshold was a lot lower than a lot of people anticipated. Like, part of me wanted to believe that that was right, and that there just wasn't going to be an October and November wave, in which case the recovery in the fall would have accelerated and a relief package would have been less necessary. But I do think you got tangled up the sort of Senate resistance to a bill was an entanglement of sort of ideological preconceptions, resistance to sort of the idea of a blue state bailout, with this sort of increasing commitment among Republicans to the idea that, like, no, the worst of the pandemic was over. The media had, it was now overblown. It was less dangerous than we thought, and we could go into the fall confident that things were just going to keep getting better, and they just didn't.
And Oren, did you want to weigh in on this one as well? Politics also, we talked on the podcast, I guess, about, was Trump's ability to be more of a populist hindered by exactly this, by the Republican Congress? And, what could he have done if he had tried, maybe?
Yeah, that was the piece I wanted to pick up on, is the relationship with Congress is such an interesting one. And in a sense, it fits in personnel. I mean, the president doesn't get to pick the Congress, but something that was so different about this presidency than a typical one was that you didn't have the sort of alignment with either party that a president could typically count on with one. I think on the podcast, you'd at one point phrased it as, of course, in the first couple of years, Trump had to deal with a Republican Congress, which I thought was funny, because on the one hand, that was an apt description of the situation. But of course, usually you would say the greatest blessing an incoming administration could have was control of the Congress in its own party.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, to some extent, this kind of goes back to all the same themes. One, that you have the iconoclast without the institutional support. More so, I think, to the point that Ross and Rachel have made. Oh, that's funny. We have Ross and Rachel here. I hadn't appreciated that until now. That's my main insight from this conversation.
And now
I forgot what I was going to say. The bigger challenge, in a sense, was that you had with this Congress folks who mostly wanted to go in a different direction, and then no willingness from or capability in the administration to actually do what a White House does to manage negotiations. Somewhat that was personnel, but an awful lot was the president himself. I mean, I don't know how you make progress in pushing people to hold a line, or make progress when the principal is kind of changing position constantly. And so, I think there were probably an awful lot of folks in Congress who, if they felt like, yes, if we get behind this, this will actually happen, maybe would have done it, but for at least politically wisely said, well, we don't know where this is going to be tomorrow, and it might be in a different place the next day. And there's just there's not a lot to be gained and an awful lot to be lost by sticking our necks out. And so I think that happened on issues throughout the presidency, and then certainly and most so at the end here.
Can I just add, though, that one of the things that most surprised me about how Trump sort of interacted with Congress was his unwillingness, I think, or whatever it was. He refused to use the tremendous amount of political capital that he had. You had how many Senate Republicans in cycle this year? And at no point, did Trump, as the most popular Republican in the country, tie any of that to support for his priorities. He sort of blanket endorsed all of them, without any quid pro quo, as far as I could tell. There was no threat of, hey, I'm not going to come put my arm around you in X state if you don't, help me with my key priorities. And that, you can draw I think Trump was very good at sort of grassroots based style politics. I think he was less adept, and I think had a team that wasn't interested in sort of the party, Washington machinations that I think would have made him much more successful on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, but I would ask, but what were his priorities? I mean, did Trump want a second stimulus or a second COVID relief bill?
I mean, my impression was that he did. I think the agnosticism was sort of in the details itself. I think that's the part he outsourced. And that, I think, is the open question of what did the staff and personnel want? Because I think that was a little less clear.
Yeah, that's another big, I guess, marquee point of the series of articles is that there kind of is no Trumpism, or there is none yet. What do you mean by that, Oren?
Well, it's a question that I hear kind of come up a lot is, can you have Trumpism without Trump? To accepting the premise of that question, I would say the answer is surely no, but that's because I don't know what Trumpism means except Trump himself. I mean, I think if you look, one of the things that was most interesting in working on this project, and I think comes through most clearly in Wells King's essay, where Wells kind of goes through, let's talk about what agency, what each agency actually did, is for almost every example of one kind of policy that seems to clearly lean in one direction and advance a priority, you can find a statement or a policy or an appointment that is essentially the equal and opposite. And even, when you think about it, one of the kind of top issues, something like immigration, on the one hand, you had some very clear, quite restrictionist language and policies, but then you also had a series of appointments and rhetoric and even policy on particularly guest visas of various sorts that kind of suggested an enthusiasm for aggressively expanding immigration. Certainly with just one other example, I think with, if you look at Wall Street and financial markets, I think you see the same thing where on the one hand, you would expect and at sometimes see a real sort of skepticism of a Wall Street led economy. And then on the other hand, in both the appointments and the regulatory moves, you see kind of exactly the approach you'd expect from the most pro-white, pro Wall Street Republican you might have in office.
See, I don't know. I think we know what Trumpism is. I mean, I think there's a question of, is there a better, richer, more effective Trumpism, right? A Trumpism that sort of, has one, more focus on personnel and policy details, and two, has, the kind of agenda for, what do you do with that running hot economy, right? To Oren's point. But look, I mean, Trump dramatically shifted Republican policy emphases from where the party was in the Romney-Ryan campaign in 2012, right? In ways that we just sort of take for granted. Like, we take it for granted that, even if Mick Mulvaney is putting out budgets that seem to cut Medicaid or something, that the Republican Party under Trump was just not organized around entitlement reform and was not, had sort of given up on what was throughout the Obama era a huge organizing idea for the Republican coalition. Or on foreign policy, the fact that there's endless confusion and competing personnel and, John Bolton wanting to bomb Iran and so on, you still can say that there's a radical revision under Trump from where the party was under George W. Bush in terms of its attitude towards democracy promotion, overseas military deployment, all these kind of things. There is this clear attempted pivot away from the Middle East towards China, joined to kind of this realpolitik in the Middle East itself. I think all of that is pretty clear. And what Oren is describing is the fact that despite that clarity, there was, all kinds of chaos and uncertainty in implementation because there weren't enough people at high levels who believed in the whole package. But the whole package is still there, or the whole package was still there. It was something real that was distinct from both Bushism and Ryanism, even as it picked up pieces from both.
I think I agree more on the foreign policy side, and we in this program, and as I think generally, I was very much focused on the kind of economic and domestic policy side. But I think it's telling that even Ross's primary example of obvious Trumpism was one in which his budget director and later chief of staff did exactly the opposite. I mean, if Trump is, and in fact, they, not just in proposals, if you look at what they did on Medicaid with work requirements, if you look at what they did to try to frustrate Obamacare, you can say, well, that's not what Trump wanted. Trump was sort of his rallies in 2016, but that's certainly, I don't think that rises to the level of an ism, I would argue. I would say that's just Trump. And then, the one other thing that I always find fascinating is Trump obviously spoke very differently about immigration and trade. But if you actually look at his policies, they are almost indistinguishable from what Romney ran on in 2012 on both issues.
That's true, but Romney in that sense, Romney, to an extent that people maybe don't always acknowledge, on China and immigration, Romney anticipated. That was the Trumpist part of the Romney agenda, you could say.
That could be. Anyway, these are the reasons I say it's hard to actually make out a Trump. I think Trump obviously is an incredibly significant figure, and there are many things you could define about him. I think adding ism to the end and creating something coherent enough to ask how it would be carried forward, I think, as opposed to it kind of having a lot of lessons to be learned from that need to be built on, is how I would draw the distinction anyway.
It's not the king, it's his wicked ministers, of course, right? Well, it seems like some of these shifts, though, Ross, even if we don't call them Trumpism, you see them as positives. And so if you wanted to see those continue, what would be your maybe top 3 suggestions for conservatives?
Well, my first suggestion is a very unpopular one with conservatives at the moment, which is to recognize that Trump probably did actually lose the election. And I think that, to Oren's point, I think we can go back and forth about the coherence of Trumpism as an ism, but however coherent it is, it looks more like a foundation than a fulfillment. And so if you think of it as a foundation rather than a fulfillment, you have to think about, well, what do you do differently first politically to expand the base of support for this kind of conservatism beyond the 46 to 47% of the country that voted for Trump. And, right now, and this, maybe it won't look like this 6 months from now, but right now, conservatives are not having an argument about well, why did Trump lose and what can we learn from it? They're having an argument about, how Trump really won and it was stolen from him, which sets you up, I think, for a near future in which a lot of conservatives just don't see any need to sort of think beyond the foundation. I guess that's my concern about where the conservative narrative, I guess, is right now, that they're, that to sort of be big picture about it, right? Like, to really govern the United States of America, like the US is, we're a republic, not a democracy. Okay. But we're a democratic republic. Like, the majorities matter. And historically, all transformational presidents have at some point or another claimed supermajorities. And I just don't right now see a lot of thinking in the Republican Party about how you get to, maybe 60%, maybe the 72 landslide is beyond us in a polarized era. But a Republican president who won 55% of the vote would find it a lot easier to do all of the kind of things we're talking about than a Republican president who is trying to sneak through with an electoral college majority. And I think before you even get to the policy issues, so obviously they're intertwined, you want to think about the political problem and say, this is our foundation, but what you should aspire to is not, litigating the Georgia election. You should aspire to winning the way Reagan did.
Yeah, I suppose so. But if we're encouraged by a majority of the country being socially conservative and economically liberal, the other thing that there are majorities of people that are is conspiracy theorists. It's just sort of a given. It's how Americans are.
Sometimes conspiracy theories are true. I just don't think this one is. But
and Rachel, same question to you. If we're encouraged by these shifts, what are the best ways for Republicans to be carrying it forward?
So this is a very critical question because, I actually do think Trump accomplished quite a lot. I think, when I talk to people on the left, they're like, well, Trump was terrible. He was no different than any other Republican. But I think when you look at what he was up against, when you look at how he was bedeviled by his own people and up against very establishment structures in Republican Washington, what he did manage to accomplish was remarkable. But my biggest critique, I think, of Trump himself was that while he was very good at, I think, recognizing what resonated intuitively with people, I think he recognized his own election as more of a moment than a movement. And I think that sets up a very critical time for Republicans, many of whom are now fighting for what that movement is, or is it just a moment? And if it is a movement, if we call it the MAGA movement or Trumpism itself, I think there's a very dedicated part of DC that wants to push a lot of sort of Bushism under the MAGA tent and call it MAGA. And so I think there's very much a fight for this soul of who we're going to be going forward, and a failure to recognize, I think, what Trump did, what propelled him into office, and to Ross's point, what we should be learning from it. But I'm very aware of this moment as a very critical one for us going forward, because there's a lot of people, I think, trying to claim the mantle of what MAGA is when perhaps it is just looking backwards instead of forwards.
Now, we're almost out of time, so why don't we give you the last word, Oren?
Oh, terrific. And let me tell you everything wrong that Rachel and Ross just said. I agree with pretty much everything they both just said. The other thing that comes to mind for me, and I wanted to put this in the symposium and everyone yelled at me and made me take it out, but they can't stop me from saying it now, is that I think there's sort of there's sort of a Marie Kondo lesson to be learned here, which is that you really have to go through, like Rachel said, the Trump administration did a lot, and you kind of have to go through and touch each piece and ask, does it spark joy? I think it's so tempting to either want to be pro-Trump and therefore defend everything, or be anti-Trump and therefore explain it all away. Or, I even, thinking about earlier when I was talking about kind of the economic results, I was trying to explain that Trump, some of Trump's policies probably weren't responsible, but then that leads me to say, like, well, so, the trade policy didn't accomplish anything in the short run, when even there, it's actually much more important to go through. They did a lot of things on trade, and some of them with resetting the China relationship, with actions at USTR, were really good and important. On immigration, it's the same way. I think there are some things that you'd say were either awful or awfully done, and others that were really important and effective reforms. And so I think, getting to the point where we can talk about it in those terms and less, forget about left versus right polarization, be less kind of tribal even within the right of center, and not have to have it all be viewed through the lens of Trump, but rather viewed as an administration. And be able to say some of this really needs to be discarded and isn't the way forward, but others of it is exactly the way forward. And so, to Ross's point, I guess if I could just extend on the foundation metaphor, there's sort of, a foundation, and then also a lot of sort of detritus and refuse and holes left over from the construction. And it's important to clean up and fill those in, but also build from what we have. And so I think that's the project going forward.
Well, we'll leave it there. This has been What Happened, the Trump Presidency in Review. I'd like to thank all of our guests, Ross Douthat, Rachel Bovard, and Oren Cass, Get in touch with us. We'll be on Twitter. Give us your thoughts, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.